Hello and welcome to Microsoft Hates Greg. My name is Greg Deckler, and today we're going to be talking about two additional concepts from Practical Charts by Nick. And since I've completely massacred this poor dude's name in the past videos, I'm just going to let him say his own name so that I don't just destroy it. All right, so hopefully everybody heard that. I'm just going to call him Nick from right now from that point on. All right, so the concepts we're going to be showing are heat maps and jitter plots. And jitter plots are not something I was even really familiar with before reading Nick's book, Practical Charts and more Practical Charts. So really good stuff. Again, shameless plug for Nick's books, man. They're awesome. You should buy them. All right. So let's get into this. Before we do that, though, before we do that, my sticker is still out there. It's in the lead, but I haven't seen any more shenanigans from this guy lately. But there's always the possibility. So links in the description. Go vote for my sticker. All right, enough about that. Let's get into this. Okay, so the first thing when we're talking about heat maps in Power BI, and this is something both heat maps and jitter plots are something that thankfully are actually relatively easy to implement in Power BI. Unlike some of the past things I've tried to do from my learnings from Nick's books. In fact, the biggest thing that was the biggest thing that was the holdup on this was just getting the data in a format that I could then use in a heat map. We'll get into that in a little bit, but the first thing you'll notice is that there is no heat map visual, right? There's no visual called heat map. The tree map sort of looks like it might work, but it's not the same thing as a heat map. Could be used for a heat map, maybe with some, if you put all the sizes in the same way. I didn't really get into that because in my opinion, there's an easier way to do it. But there is this heat map, this table heat map 3.5.0 that you can get from going out to get more visuals, right? Get more visuals, and then search for heat map. And so there is the table heat map. And the thing you might want to notice about it is that it's got 1 star, one single star from I think one review. So it does not, that does not hold us that is not really you don't really have a lot of hope when you see something like that. Um, and I don't know, I wish I could rate this thing because I would also rate this thing 1 star. And I'll show you why. It's pretty horrific. Um, so let's talk about the setup for this real quick. The biggest thing that I had in Nick's setup for his data, let's not get into that. Let's not get into that. He was using these formulas where he was taking some base value times some other value that he had, and then using the norm inverse, which is your normal distribution, inverse of that, with some specific settings here, rand 1, 0.1. But I needed this to be more in this format for it to really work, where I had my attribute like unpivoted, right? Um, so I was like, okay, well, I need to do that in Power Query so that I can unpivot it, right? I need to add that column in Power Query, but it turned out that it wasn't so easy. I went out and stole a function from MK Feldman that I thought might work, but I really couldn't get it to work the way I wanted it to work. Um, so as you can see here, I added these custom columns where I tried to implement the formulas, right? The base times 50 times 1 divided by the F normal distribution of number.random, 1, 0. It wasn't working out. It was getting some of these numbers were just crazy big and others were like really small. And so it really didn't really work that well. So you can see like plus 23, plus 14, plus 24, you know, e to the 17th, e to the 13th. So these numbers were they're just so off in terms of relative to one another. Like one number would always be super huge compared to the rest. It really was not providing a very good looking heat map. So I'm not sure what is going on, if I screwed up implementing that function or not using it right. Maybe I tried with like using cumulative, not using cumulative. I don't know. Couldn't figure it out. So, and I know that there are people out there supposedly that have like 20 reasons perhaps that why you shouldn't use calculated columns. But guess what? calculated columns are really handy, especially when you're trying to translate Excel formulas into Power BI, because you have a lot of the same Excel functions in Power BI. Because guess what? You have this you have the norm inverse function right there in DAX, right? It's the same as the one in Excel. So what did I do? Well, what I did was I created calculated columns for each one of these, right? And then I decided to say, well, DAX isn't good at unpivoting. Like I've written a DAX unpivot, but it sucks in terms of it's really convoluted, and it, it's just it's not DAX's thing to unpivot tables, even though it can be done. It's out there in the quick measure gallery. But what you can do is you can say copy table, right? You can then go back to transform data. This is the final table, right? You can do an enter data query, which is what I did, and I just pasted that table in, and then guess what? I can unpivot it. Boom, right? So here's the thing. Ignore people that are absolutists and say crazy stuff like you can never use calculated columns and that stuff. They're not in their right mind, okay? It's all about use the tools, it's really easy to recreate that formula in DAX, right? But it's very difficult to do it in Power Query because Power Query does not have a norm dot in the inverse function, right? It just doesn't exist in the language. You have to go back and you have to write a whole function to do it. And if you see this function, right, it's substantial. There's a substantial amount of code here, right? Like, why would spend your time doing that when it's so easy to do it in DAX? But DAX isn't good at unpivoting. So, okay, so use Power Query for that, right? Use the tools, to your benefit, okay? Regardless of what anybody says, whether it's a calculated column, not a calculated column, whatever it is, just use, the tools and use them to your benefit, and you'll be fine. And you don't have to worry about any crazy people that say otherwise. All right, so once we had that, we have our final table. So I did take a look at is it here? Nope. Okay, so let's take a look at this table, this table heat map visual. So let's go ahead and do our final table, and it's only got just category. So maybe I can pull attribute in here, right? Which is like our weekdays or whatever. And then I pull this value in here. I don't even know what this is trying to display or what this is trying to convey to me. Like, I didn't ask it to create buckets down here or anything else. It's like, it sort of did it, I guess, right? But it's not the way that I want it. It's not a heat map visual in terms of what I want is I want my weeks right down this side and then my weekdays across here and have a heat map. And there's no way to get there. I guess that's why this is called a table heat map visual and not a matrix heat map visual. But I don't know what I would ever use this for. And it's ugly, and it's just, if I could give it 1 star, I would go back in there and rate it and give it 1 star because it's just terrible. It has, I don't even know what this is. Color brewer? What the heck is a color brewer? Like, that isn't even a word. You can enable the color brewer or not. Then it's like, I don't know who created this, but it's like they have all this room here, but I guess, purple, this is purple red, but then they spell out purples. Why not just use PUs, right? And this is purple orange. I have no idea what PRGN is. Like, I would think that's like purple, red, green, but it doesn't really seem to be that. So I don't even know what half of these things stand for. They're all different color variations. Spectral, accent dark paired, set one. How descriptive, right? This thing is, how is that dark? That I would think that would be like blacks and grays and stuff. Anyway, don't use this table visual. This thing should be destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. It is an awful, awful thing. All right, so luckily, it actually is rather easy to create a heat map using just the standard matrix, right? And I'll show you how I did this one. It's very simple, right? I can go and change that to a matrix, right? Here we go. And I want my weeks down as my rows. I want my attribute, which are my weekday names, across there. And then for my values, I can slap my values in here. Okay, now we have this. And we want to get the totals off because we don't really care about the totals. All right, get rid of those. Easy enough. Now what we can do is, back here, and go to our values. We can go, oh, sorry. Ah, conditional formatting. Here we go. We set our conditional one. Now, luckily, sum of value, it's got a nice gradient here. The actual default setting for this is just fine, right? So we go ahead and set that for our background. And then we just go back here and do it again, conditional formatting, and say font color, and we make it the same. And boom, now our values don't show up. We just show up as what we want, which are just, our heat map, which is nice. And heat map is really nice for showing basically when you have a lot of data that it's difficult to make sense of. Nick goes in and explains along with a lot of other things. When you have something like that, that this is a nice way to show some patterns, right? And he is the example is the book. This isn't exact, but the example he uses in the book shows a nice pattern where there's like a bump at certain points in the week and that sort of thing, or in the day and that sort of stuff. So, but anyway, this one doesn't show as many good patterns because I couldn't replicate his formulas exactly, but I just was interested in just creating a heat map. Okay, so that is the heat map. So let's move on to jitter plots. And like I said, jitter plots that's something I'd never really heard of. But the jitter plot setup, the jitter map, or jitter plot, the data for it is basically employee salaries. So we have a bunch of data of salaries, and then we have a y.5. And so the idea is like, well, we want to have show this on like a scatter plot. So I have that right here. So you notice, when we have this, even if we start to drag this out, it's really hard to see, what's going on. Like there's just so many overlapping values, right? So how do you solve that? Well, the way that Nick, one of the techniques that Nick covers in the book is that where's my selection pane? And then there we go. Well, where is it? I don't know. There it is, but it's not showing up. Oh, I was on tab order. Oh, sometimes Power BI. Okay, too much clicky clicky. All right, so the interesting thing about this, the jitter plot, what it does, it changes the y-axis just slightly so that it goes, it has a range value. So now I can see a lot more of the individual point plots, right? Versus this, where they're all too much overlapping, but I can still sort of get some pattern recognition from this. So the way they did this is basically you do a jitter y, take the y times a random number, right? Return random, returning a number between 0 and 1. So then this number becomes, some number between, the top end value of 0.5 and a low end value of 0 as far as the y-axis. And now it shows up like this. Now, the nice thing about this is you can still see patterns in this. And maybe if I zoom in on this a little bit. So the nice thing about this is you can still see the patterns, like where the clusters are and things like that. It's a lot more obvious, I think. Like you might think that the clusters, if you were looking at this, the clusters are right here, and maybe I should extend this out to be the same size, but right. But anyway, I think it's a lot clearer where the clusters are, which it can get really lost in here, especially if this was shrunk down a little more. Now, but the important thing that I found in this is to pick the right colors. This is something Nick does a phenomenal job. In fact, I stole this color specifically from some of the files that Nick sent me, because if you notice, right, you have, if there's something that's individual, it shows kind of a lighter shade. But then they blend together really well when there's stacked visuals and they get darker as they get stacked. So you can see that here, right? You can see where the intersection of these, where they get darker, but that is not very clear always when you are talking about the different colors that you can use. So I go to my markers and then go to my color, right? So right now I'm using this color right now, but if I use even something like this color, right, it's not even as clear, right? And especially if you use like a darker color, right? It's soup, it's I think it gets saturated as well, although that's not terrible either. But certain color combinations I found, like made it not as clear as far as, using something like what Nick uses, which was this color, which I think is good. And though I do have to say that is not terrible either. Although kind of if you go away from it a little bit, maybe they blend in a little bit more. But important, I would say, to pay attention to the color that you're going to use in this kind of a chart, where in order to make sure that you can actually see the difference and see where the clusters are and the overlaps. So I think some colors do that better than others. And let's see how this looks. Yeah, see, I mean, if you go back and you're not zoomed in on this thing, like this I don't think shows up nearly as well as like when using Nick's colors, where I think that's a little more clear that okay, these are lighter and then these get darker in that. So anyway, it's something to have to play with as far as the colors and that goes. Again, Nick does a great job of that in his book. His color palettes are always phenomenal, and always do a great job of conveying the information. So I think I might try to cover a shape map plots or something like that. I have to go and look or whatever, but there's another couple where he combines like shape maps and then shape size maps is what he calls it, and then like scatter plot maps and stuff into a single visual, which I think is a cool concept. And so I'd like to try to see if I can actually replicate and do that within Power BI. But that is all I had for this video. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.